The beginning of African slavery started in 1619 when a shipment of 16 or so slaves arrived in Jamestown. This set a precedent for the other colonies, who began implementing African slavery. Beginning in 1653, the tragic practice of chattel slavery took place throughout the town of Stoneham, Massachusetts, focusing primarily on family and house slavery. In response to numerous court cases, the abolitionist movement in Massachusetts was triumphantly successful in abolishing slavery by 1783, leading to greater equality for African Americans in Massachusetts and further influencing nearby states to follow suit. Stoneham, Massachusetts was originated in 1645 and came to be known as Charlestown End. The town was founded by men who struggled with finding churches and schools. The town originally consisted of 13 families, to be precise, 2 decades before John Winthrop founded the Bass Bay Colony. After Stoneham was discovered, then came the slaves. The Atlantic slave trade brought the slaves to the New World and introduced slavery in New England. After the Pequot War in 1636, the colonists attempted to make the captured natives their slaves, but the natives were not very efficient as slaves, so the colonists decided to look to Africa. The first shipment of slaves came from the West Indies by ship in horrible conditions. Slaves arrived in New England by the transatlantic slave route. Coming from Alexander Falconbridge's account on the slave trade, Falconbridge describes their journey by mentioning that the men Negroes, on being brought aboard the ship, are immediately fastened together, 2 and 2, by handcuffs on their wrists and by irons riveted on their legs. The voyage was 7 months long, and many slaves did not make it due to disease or mistreatment. Slavery first began to grow in Massachusetts and finally became legal in 1641 and was said to be legal for the next 140 years. In regards to how slaves were distributed to slave owners, a law in 1670 was passed which allowed slave owners to sell their slaves, more specifically the children of their slaves, in bondage. This meant that only a few slaves were sold together because the colony was not known for agriculture. Many slave owners looked for younger men with potential who were cheap and easily trainable. The earliest found slave that was recorded in the Stoneham area was in 1653. A popular slave-owning family was the Greens, and they were most likely the first to own slaves in Stoneham. These pictures show the graves of the Green and Hayes families that were major slave-owning families in Stoneham. They were buried in the old burial ground in Stoneham.
That there's an area in the old burying ground that has no markers where I was told enslaved people, and including maybe a couple Indians and some poor whites were buried.
Because of the normalization of slavery in early America, African American people working for white families became typical. In 1641, the Body of Liberties was published in Massachusetts, which was a set of liberties for the white colonists, which was to be used by the General Court. Stated in Article 91 of this document that there shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be lawful, captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. This published set of liberties is what made Massachusetts become the first New England colony to sanction slavery. As mentioned in Ben Jacques' book, In Graves Unmarked, men undertook a wide variety of tasks away from the households. Women were most exclusively domestic servants.
Stoneham was a town formed by farmers and shoemakers and working people. So the farmers who did very well and owned enough land and could buy enough land could afford then to purchase slave labor.
As well as being passed along like objects, the children of slaves also became property of their mother's owners. As also stated in Graves Unmarked, slavery in Massachusetts was further cemented in 1670 when the colony extended the ownership of slaves to include the children of enslaved women, thus establishing slavery in perpetuity. Although slaves were granted many rights, they were allowed to get married as well as attend Stoneham's town meetings. Town meetings typically turned to chaos due to the opposing arguments of slavery. Not everyone believed slavery was fair, and most wanted it to be abolished, so fights and arguments would take place. Although marriage within slavery was allowed, historian Emily Blanc describes it by saying, "Marriage was legal and even encouraged by Massachusetts clergy, but marriage bestowed no right to the married couple. Men and women frequently lived apart, and a free husband could not impart freedom to his wife, although offspring of free mothers were born free." In regards to town meetings, Silas Dean's novel, says that, voted that the Negro men in Stoneham shall sit in the hind seat in the side gallery. This means slaves were allowed to sit in during town meetings. The town meeting house was also the location of Stoneham's church. Slaves living in Stoneham at the time were not granted the same accommodations as the white civilians, but as indicated in William Burnham Stevens' A History of Stoneham, Massachusetts, the colored people, though in a state of slavery, were admitted as brethren and sisters to the church. Slavery in the southern states of colonial America was very different from slavery in the northern states, including the colony of Massachusetts. As stated in Lathan K's article, Difference Between Southern and Northern States Before the Civil War, southern states continued to invest in plantations and relied on slave labor to meet their production needs.
And what was different from slavery in this area and the South was that they did not have the big plantations where they did develop cash crops where they might have hundreds of slaves.
Slavery in the northern states, however, was more domestic work and collecting resources for the families to which the slaves belonged to. The cruel treatment of slaves is one of the major tragedies in Massachusetts' history. The real tragedy involved in this topic is the treatment of these human beings and how they were looked at as objects rather than people. These slaves were stripped away from their home country, separated from their families, forced to speak a different language and praise a new religion, and were involuntarily placed into a life of labor without compensation. An example of this mistreatment is shown in Wendy Warren's novel, New England Bound, when she mentions how a slave owner named Samuel Maverick ordered one of his slaves to rape another in hopes of breeding them. Aside from rape, slaves were whipped, branded, hung, burned, and sent to the death penalty as punishments for a number of different offenses. However, the worst punishment for a slave who committed a crime was being sold to plantations in the South or Caribbean. This meant a sentence of life-shortening labor, as well as the breaking of all family and social ties, as described by Ben Jacques and in Graves Unmarked. In 1754, the governor of Massachusetts at the time requested that all cities record an official census of the amount of slaves that were living in the city during that year. In Stoneham, there was a recorded number of 8 slaves, including 6 males and 2 females. This shows that slavery wasn't just something that happened to the people from another country or even state. It happened right here in Stoneham, Massachusetts. This horrendous treatment started a revolution of slaves to fight for their freedom and begin to terminate slavery altogether. The legal side to the abolition of slavery came from lawsuits filed by slaves mistreated by their owners. The end of slavery in Massachusetts was a triumph in history, caused by numerous court cases against slave owners. Notorious cases were Elizabeth Freeman and Quock Walker. Elizabeth Freeman filed a lawsuit against her owner, John Ashley, because he hit her. She won the case and was the first enslaved African to be freed under the Massachusetts Constitution, and her case set precedent for the Quock Walker case. The Quock Walker case is known as the case that changed the legality of slavery in Massachusetts. Quock Walker was severely beaten by Nathaniel Jennison after being granted freedom from a deceased owner. Quock had previously been owned by Jennison but escaped to the Cadwells. Quock was given freedom when the oldest Cadwell died and gave him freedom after the age of 25. Quock took the case to court and won the first case. His attacker then sued the Cadwells for stealing their property and was granted a sum of money. The court then found Jennison guilty of assault and battery under the Massachusetts Constitution. Abolishing slavery was a controversial topic with many people on both sides. One group of abolitionists out of Massachusetts called themselves the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. It was founded by William Lloyd Garrison, who was known for his radical opinion on many issues, including the abolition of slavery, women's rights, and pacifism. Charles Sumner was also known for his view on anti-slavery. He was part of the U.S. Senate and wanted to repeal acts like the Fugitive Slave Act, and was even beaten for his stance on pro-abolition. Abolition of slavery in northern colonies influenced Massachusetts to abolish slavery, which directly impacts the people of Stoneham. Massachusetts was also influenced by other colonies that were abolishing slavery. Pennsylvania was the first state to pass an act granting the gradual abolition of slavery in its borders. We conceive that it is our duty, and we rejoice that it is in our power, to extend a portion of that freedom to others which hath been extended to us, and release from that state of thraldom, an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. This act was the first of many and influenced other colonies to follow suit. Slavery was abolished in 1780 but wasn't considered illegal until 1863 due to the Emancipation Proclamation and the Confiscation Acts. The 13th Amendment was then passed in 1865, putting an official end to slavery. In Boston, free and former slaves formed a welcoming community. African Americans were interested in churches and formed the African Meeting House in Boston. Schooling was offered for black children, and many black people took on the role of masons. In a long period of suffering, slaves were granted more freedom in Boston, Massachusetts, including in the town of Stoneham.